Hello, and welcome to Exploring Journalism's Future, a podcast powered by the Institute for Media and Public Trust at Fresno State. I'm Betsy Hayes, faculty in the Department of Media, Communications, and Journalism at the university. So, from analyzing existing models to discovering innovative ones and everything in between, we are really excited to have wonderful special guests to share with us their perspective on exploring journalism's future. And this is a special episode. So we are in between seasons. So we're so excited to give you this special episode. We have with us today Joe Moore, President and General Manager of KVPR, 89.3 and 89.1 FM. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Betsy. It's a great honor to be on the podcast. Love what you've built here in the prior season and happy to be on this bonus episode.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with you. And so, full disclosure, I've known Joe for quite some time. Knew you as a student at Fresno State. And so this is so much fun to talk to you in this capacity. But share with everyone else your journey to KVPR. How did you end up where you are?
Yeah, I've been with the station now for about 15 years. In my current stint with KVPR, I spent about 7 years or a little over 7 years as our director of program content. In that capacity, I supervised station programming and I also launched our local newsroom. We did not have a local news operation before that, so got that underway. And then in 2018, I assumed a new role at the station as president and general manager of the company. And I've been leading the organization since. It's been a pretty quiet run. We had COVID-19, January 6th, big changes in our industry, and now defunding of public media. So it's been fairly quiet overall.
Yes, definitely that whole brings a new meaning to never a dull moment, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
indeed.
And in addition to all of that wonderful, your wonderful history at Valley Public Radio, KVPR, you also ran the station at Fresno State. So you've actually been in radio for how many years?
I've been in radio for a little over 25 years now.
Yes.
I started out as a student volunteer at KFSR years ago, worked a variety of different radio jobs, did some things with the local ESPN station, a talk station in Porterville, did sports broadcasts, worked at KVPR for 2 years on the weekends doing the early morning show, and then wound up coming back to Fresno State and was the one full-time employee supervising the student volunteers, the other community volunteers at KFSR. And I did that from about 2002, 2004 through 2008.
Yeah. So I guess it's safe to say that once you got started in radio, you have never looked back. Is that correct?
I guess so. It wasn't something that I intended to do. I actually thought I was going to go on and get a degree in history or something like that and pursue an advanced degree and wind up teaching or writing books. And I was already working in radio and thought, hey, I kind of like this. Maybe I'll just see where this goes. And haven't turned back since, I guess. Who knows where the next chapter is, but excited about where we are today and what we've been able to build. And Fresno State's been such a great partner over the years and huge fans of what everyone in the MCJ department does.
Oh, well, thank you. And you talked about, gosh, and especially, creating the news component, right, for KVPR. That's such a significant, influence in your particular role there. What about public radio attracted you? What was it about the idea of public radio that made you sort of gravitate in that direction?
That's a good question. I've worked in a variety of settings. I have done some commercial work, but most of the work that I've done has been on the nonprofit, non-commercial side. And I think that there's a few differences. Commercial broadcast media has been on a certain trajectory, and it's really been a big focus on automation and reducing jobs. At the same time, public media, we've taken those same technologies, but we've been able to grow our operations over the years. And if you look at the growth of nonprofit newsrooms, public media really invented the nonprofit newsroom model over the past 40 years. But really, over the last 20 years, local public radio stations have heavily invested in their local journalism capacity. At the same time, when on the commercial and for-profit side of the equation, we've seen declines and job cuts.
Mhm.
So I think it's great to have a larger palette and more freedom and more time in the hour and more time. We aren't dealing with the commercial breaks and things like that that our peers in the for-profit side are dealing with. But it's also a great opportunity to be able to engage directly with our listeners and create content where it may not be financially profitable to do an undertaking where you're going out and doing coverage of these communities that are smaller or don't have the resources that would support a commercial operation, whereas public media has been able to invest and grow. And if you combine all of the nation's public radio stations together and their newsrooms together, this would be the largest newsroom in the country as a network. Now, it doesn't always operate as a network in that fashion, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do as a federation and as a system is work more closely together. But we think that's one of the great things about public media, at least to where we are today,
Mhm.
is that we have that investment and that local on the ground presence in all of these communities across the country. The New York Times doesn't have on the ground reporters in the middle of Alaska, but the Alaska NPR stations do. And the same for Indian reservations in the Southwest or in communities in the Midwest or right here in Central California. So we think that's one of the great things about public media, and it's one of the things that I really love about it.
I love that. And a perfect segue to my next question. Because is there a moment in your career that made you think, this is why I do this?
That's a really good question. I would have a hard time pinpointing any one moment, but I think of a lot of similar moments
Mhm.
where you get a call from a listener or a person writes in an email or you meet them at a station event. And, I've had people tell me how the radio station is something they heard on KVPR saved their life or helped them save a life. I was talking to a physician recently, and they talked about hearing something on KVPR about an innovative new substance abuse treatment program that was rolling out very preliminary stages in one community. And they said, we're now doing that in Fresno, and it's a huge success, and people's lives are being saved. And that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't heard that NPR show that you aired. That's just one example. But I think back to all of those individual interactions, and sometimes it's just, hey Joe, I love that segment I heard the other day. It changed my mood and it really made me happy. Those are the things that I think I find most rewarding. It's not always about the big epiphany moment. Radio, Garrison Keillor, the host of Prairie Home Companion, once compared radio to like building a sandcastle. You spend all this time building this elaborate, beautiful sandcastle, and then the wave comes and washes it away, and you get to start all over again because it's ephemeral. There's always a new show and always a new series, a new show, a new hour, and then it's on to the next thing. So I don't necessarily think in terms of any one big arc, but it's all these waves crashing on the shore, and there's always another one. And I think that maybe that's one of the other really rewarding things is it's never the same. It's always different. There's always a chance to say, how can we be better? How can we sound better? And I've been doing this at this station in some capacity for 15 years now. And, I was telling my team the other day, I think we've never sounded better on the air. And I hope that I'm able to say that next month and next year as well, as like we're always trying to marshal those skills and technologies and experiences and knowledge and put it all together and give the best product that our listeners can possibly receive, and they expect that.
Mhm.
So that's what I like, that there's always a new opportunity every day.
Yep, absolutely. So, what role do you think local NPR stations play? And we talked about this a little bit in your last answer, but what role overall do you think that local NPR stations play in shaping community identity?
That's a really good question. I like the way you phrased that, because I would say that that is maybe parallel, but slightly different than just informing a community, or just reporting on the news, because I think that that involves a larger context
Mhm.
that's at play there. You can deliver the news, but you also need to represent your community. You need to reflect your community. You need to make sure your station sounds like your community. And stations are always trying to do that. And I think that means a lot of different things, because we live in a very diverse country. We live in a very diverse community. So, how can we as KVPR reflect that? Well, it's in our programming, the programs we select. Now, most of our audience probably knows us for the NPR flagship programs like Morning Edition, All Things Considered, but there's a lot of other shows that are on throughout our broadcast day, and we try to find things that resonate with our audience.
Mhm.
Then there's our local coverage, or what are the stories we're covering? Who are the voices that are on the air that are delivering that coverage, and how do they connect on a personality level, but also just in their own story with the community? Then you have more station sound and overall what we call stationality,
Oh, yeah.
in the way that the station presents itself to the community. You want to go on the air and you want to say Visalia. You don't want to be that person who goes on the air and says Visalia, because the people who live here will know, oh, well, that person's not from here. They don't know what they're doing. I'm going to have questions about everything else they're doing if they got that wrong. So we want to make sure we represent that. But I also think there's like a larger community narrative, and we can do that in different ways. Like for many years, KVPR ran this series called Valley Writers Read, and it was hosted by
Mhm.
Fresno City College professor Franz Weinschenk, and he would bring on local authors, fiction and nonfiction, to read their stories on the air. And you had very acclaimed, award-winning novelists, poets, and others. You had amateurs who had a personal memoir, some really powerful coverage. But I always loved that because it really spoke to the community. We did a podcast a few years ago that Alice Daniel hosted called The Other California, that really dug into 7 different communities throughout our 7 counties that we serve, and brought those stories very richly told to our audience. And we're doing something now that is something that I started doing earlier this year called Central Valley Roots, which is a series of very short, minute and a half long vignettes that are about local history, people, and places. And the thinking behind this, it's kind of a shameless ripoff of what Bob Long used to do on Channel 24 with On the Map, and then our colleagues over at KMJ, what the late Al Smith and Catherine Rehart used to do with the series they did called The Valley's Legends and Legacies. And our intent is to kind of take that forward, the work that they did, and build on that and tell news stories about Valley history and culture and the place that we call home. So I think an NPR station like KVPR has a really important part in shaping that, reflecting their community and presenting a community identity and a community narrative, and reflecting the diversity of that community. So in that series that we're doing, I'm trying to, not just hit on the big, greatest hits of Valley history, but bring up stories about, a pioneering woman, a farmer, Minna Eshelman, who was uh, an innovator on things like the dairy industry in the 1800s, animal welfare, was on the University of California Board of Regents, was an author, a published and syndicated columnist. And Minnewawa Avenue in Fresno is named for her. Fascinating woman, bring that story to light. Stories reflecting the African American community, the Native American community, all these different stories that people might not really know. And so we want to bring that to our audience and develop a sense of pride and community belonging, and tie further deepen the ties of the station to the community, because the truth is we are locally rooted. We are here in our community. Yes, we are an NPR station. The NPR logo is over there, but we are not owned by NPR. KVPR is a locally based nonprofit organization that's rooted here in our community for 47 years. And we're a partner with the national network, but we're also local first.
Mhm. And speaking of the 7 counties, what are they? What is the service area?
Yeah, so very good question. We're KVPR 89.3 and 89.1. The 89.3 comes first because it serves our largest area, and that includes Fresno County, Madera County, Merced County, Mariposa County, and then to the south, Kings and Tulare counties. And then 89.1 serves our listeners in Kern County. So we have those two broadcast frequencies that serve basically from the top of the Grapevine all the way to about Atwater on the north, and over to Los Banos and the Central Coast, the Coast Range as you're on your way to the Central Coast on that side. So it's a very broad geographical area. You can also find us on the KVPR app and on the NPR app. You can also listen to us on your smart speakers, on any connected devices like that. And you can find our podcasts like Central Valley Daily on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, as they say.
Yes. All right. Wonderful. So, how does your station decide what local stories to prioritize? You discussed how we really want to reflect the diversity and breadth and depth and deep roots that we have here. Any additional filters or sort of things that you all go through when you're discussing the myriad of stories we can cover? Why are we making these choices?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the hardest parts of the job, is because especially in today's era where we don't have 40-person, 50-person newsrooms like we maybe once had years ago at print outlets. Every story choice has to be really intentional. And you have I think we're in an era of collaboration today. So we want to choose stories wisely, and we just don't want to do one story that one of our other partners is already doing. For example, we work closely with a lot of the other nonprofit newsrooms here in the Valley. We work closely with SJV Water. We work closely with Fresno Land. We work closely with the Merced Focus. So you'll see their coverage sometimes on our air or on our podcast or on our website. And likewise, we share as well. We will try to find stories where there's an opportunity to tell a story that hasn't been told,
Mhm.
or to really go deep on a big story. We really did that with the closure of Madera Community Hospital and then the reopening of that. We've probably done 24 in-depth pieces on that story over the years. Now, clearly, other outlets were covering it as well, but we said, hey, this is super important. This is not just a hyperlocal story, it's a regional story, because this has ramifications for people throughout our area. Even if you don't live in Madera, the closure of that hospital has an impact on you if you're in Fresno, if you're in Visalia, if you're in Hanford, because all the hospitals are feeding into each other, and vice versa. The people who used to go there are now flooding into those other hospitals. So regional impact, and we made it a big reporting priority. And then finding a story that has great sound. We won a National Edward R. Murrow Award last year for the story that we did about the whitewater rafting on the Kern River. And this was a drought story, or actually, no, not a drought story, the opposite of drought story, a flood story. In 2023, we had all this record snow melt. The Kern River was raging. We sent a reporter on a raft with expedition company that goes down the Kern River and got incredible audio. And that was a story that was so well told by our reporter Joshua Yeager, in bringing the visual to life in a story that didn't have visuals, because you could picture it in your head. Your brain brought the visuals to you. And that's what made it so powerful. So sometimes it's looking for that, like what is a story that really have good sound, and or a story that can be told in a compelling way on radio. And that's those are some of the factors that go into deciding what we can cover, and maybe what we don't cover.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm appreciative that you did bring up the collaborative aspect. We've had folks from Fresno Land on and, the Merced Focus. I'm happy that you brought up that particular organization, because nonprofit news, right, is definitely one of the ways that we are definitely exploring journalism's future, right? And the collaborative versus competitive is a little bit of a shift for journalism as a whole. However, it's, working in a lot of ways, and it makes everything interesting in a different way, right? So thank you for talking about that. So let's go back to the parent company. And maybe we touched on a little bit, but let's really make sure that our listeners and viewers can understand how that is all organized. Because we're sort of used to, the parent company and then the folks underneath, like we're used to the television model, that the network television, and then we have the local stations. And you are similar to that, but not exactly. So how does that work for everybody? And then what about the content? Do you have to use it? Is it an option? Maybe talk about that in collaboration, because I think that might help us understand.
Yeah, definitely. And it is one of the least understood elements of the way the system works. They say, "Oh, hey, Joe, you work at NPR." And, you know, sometimes I don't bother to even correct people because it's such a long, process. No, I do not work for NPR. NPR does not sign my paycheck. And we are not owned by NPR. And NPR actually is, I would not say NPR is our parent company. We are a member of the NPR network. So, like other local broadcast outlets, we are a locally licensed entity. And in our case, we are locally owned. We're a nonprofit organization, so there's not any corporate owner, but the board of directors, who are all volunteers, serve as our governance for the station. And we were founded in 1975 by three students, or folks who were just recently graduated from college, and they had a vision to bring public radio to the Valley. And they had heard NPR stations in other communities and wanted to see that happen here. And the way it works is this. NPR is its own organization. They're also a nonprofit entity. They also have a board of directors. Some of those directors are elected by, the at large, appointed by the NPR, prior editions of the NPR board. Then there's a portion of the NPR board that is also voted on by stations, but stations do not own NPR, and NPR by its charter cannot own any local stations. So I've heard it best described, and people here in the Valley might actually understand this. It's almost like an agricultural co-op, where the farmers have an interest in a larger corporation, which helps distribute their product, and also it's a two-way relationship. So, but they don't own them, and the larger entity doesn't own the small station. The way the business works is this: we purchase programs from NPR and from other program producers. Those include American Public Media, PRX, the BBC, a variety of other independent producers. NPR is one of those. NPR is the largest partner that we have in purchasing programs. A lot of people think that NPR gives us the programs for free or actually pays us to run the programs. It doesn't work that way. We pay NPR and the other producers for the national programs that we run, and then we solicit donations to help pay for the operations of the station. And it's highly integrated. So the broadcast clock, as you can actually see one of the broadcast clocks behind me right now, it is essentially a big pie, and there are little slices of the pie that follow a set schedule, and those allow opportunities for customization for your local market. So there's portions of the pie where we go and do a local news break for local news headlines, or maybe another slice that offers up us a larger opportunity for a longer local story. And then all these programs fit together in various ways. So the bottom line is we are a local station. We provide local coverage and local service here in the Valley. We are a proud partner of the NPR network, and we are the only NPR affiliate in our community. But we are not owned by NPR. They do not run our station. We make the programming choices of what we air here at this level, or the local station level. And there's some NPR programs we air, some NPR programs we don't air. And there's no mandate that we air those programs. Now, we air the programs we do air because they resonate with our audience. Our most popular two programs are Morning Edition and then All Things Considered. Morning Edition's morning drive time from 3 a.m. till all the way till 9 a.m. and then All Things Considered from 3:30 till 6. And those are like the bulk of our audience. So there's no bureaucrat in Washington that's saying, all right, KVPR has to air these programs. And there are plenty of public radio stations that are not NPR members and don't air any NPR programs. So that just, there's a breadth and depth of diversity in program formats and styles and approaches in every market in the country.
And so thank you. That's super helpful. And so you talked about how you're the only NPR affiliated organization in the Central Valley. What if someone else wanted to be, in Visalia or something, wanted to also be a public radio station? Would that not work? I mean, do they purposely only have, one in certain geographical areas? So is this kind of your territory now, or how does that all work?
There's not an exclusivity
Okay.
agreement or anything like that. You'll find it varies in different communities. As the larger communities are and larger media markets, metro areas are, typically you'll find in those, the very largest markets, you'll find multiple stations. For example, in LA, you have a variety of different options. You have KCRW, which is an NPR affiliate. They do music, but they also do Morning Edition and All Things Considered and other news programs. Then you have the station that used to be known as KPCC, now is known as LAist. They're a 24/7 news operation. They also run Morning Edition. So you can choose which NPR station you want to listen to in Southern California. In Sacramento, for example, you have Capital Public Radio, but then KQED from San Francisco also has a station that simulcasts the regular KQED signal in the Sacramento market. So there's two options there.
Okay.
So there's not an exclusivity. Sometimes, stations try to cooperate or serve different elements of that audience.
Right.
There's also a lot of discussion right now about, is that model that I just described really beneficial today?
Mm-hmm.
Boston, for example, has WBUR, which is the #1 rated station. But then there's also WGBH, or what's now called GBH. And GBH is a powerhouse in itself in that it's both a television station, a public TV station, but they also have a public radio station as well.
Mm-hmm.
And their GBH radio is not as popular as WBUR. And so there are people in the industry right now saying, does that make sense? Given the lack of, the elimination of federal funding, What if we just consolidate those two stations together? Is that a good use of the airways? Is that a good use of dollars? I think there are going to be a lot of conversations like that going forward in a lot of different communities, and there may be different dominoes that fall because of what happened back in July. And it's not just about the stations in the smallest communities going dark, which I think is probably one of the most likely results of the decision to end federal funding. But then you'll also have other waves of change that are kicking off, and that could involve some of the largest markets. So it really just depends on the way things were set up. But there's not an exclusivity. There are different tiers of membership in NPR, and it comes with voting rights and all this different stuff, and the fees that stations pay, the tier level or whatever. But yeah, there is no exclusivity on station presence or having an NPR affiliate.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And also I was going to ask about whether or not there were fees attached to being an affiliate. So thank you for, yeah. So contrary to the belief of them funding y'all, you
Yes.
are paying to be part of the network, and then also you're paying for the programming, which oh, you were going to say something about that.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most interesting changes and one of the most interesting things about the whole system. So let's go back 20 years. Actually, let's make that 30 years before satellite radio, anything else. 30 years ago, there were two monopolies that existed, and they were legal monopolies. Number one, radio had a monopoly on the dashboard. Yeah, you had a cassette player in your car, or if you had a newer car, you had a CD player. Wow. But when it came to being connected to the rest of the world, radio had a monopoly. And
Mhm.
they also had a physical monopoly in that the radio was there on the dashboard. It was hardware. It's built into the car. You could touch it. You could, there was nothing else that you could access. You didn't have your Apple CarPlay or Android Auto or Sirius XM or other podcast, whatever. That didn't exist. So radio had a monopoly. Then on our side, stations, whether they were the only NPR station or not in their market, if you wanted NPR content, you had to go through your NPR station. You couldn't get it anywhere else. NPR.org didn't exist. The NPR app didn't exist. Smartphone didn't exist. So that was another monopoly.
Mhm.
That changed the business model. NPR previously at that point had a business model that really had, it was a stool that had two legs. It was fees from stations and then the sponsorship revenue that NPR could sell directly. That has changed. It's the same way that, or the same sort of change that we've seen in Hollywood and also in broadcast TV, in that digital technology has created the opportunity all of a sudden for content creators to have a direct relationship with their audience.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, NPR has an audience on its own digital platforms that doesn't go through stations, and they have a revenue stream that doesn't go through stations. So where we sit today, a little over 30% of NPR's overall revenue at the network level. And I'm not talking all the stations. I'm talking about NPR in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Avenue. 30% of their revenue comes from stations. The rest of it, other sources.
Mhm.
Podcast sponsorships, direct listener donations via NPR app, etc., ads on npr.org. That has changed the landscape significantly. And not to mention all the other competition that has changed the landscape. Now it used to be, all right, you're competing against the other 25 radio stations you can get in the market. Now it's infinite. You're competing against literally infinite options. Spotify's AI DJs, AI generated news content in theory, and custom podcast. I mean, it's a wild world, as I'm sure the listeners to this podcast know. But the dynamic has changed significantly. Yet we've been able to maintain our audience. I wouldn't say our audience is significantly larger than it was, um, 15 years ago, but we've been able to, um, you know, close to double revenue, and audience engagement. So the business model is constantly evolving. We're trying to stay on the leading edge of that as much as possible. Um, uh, with all these challenges that are out there.
Yes. And so you mentioned the federal funding
Yeah.
and not being there. So can you walk our listeners and viewers through, okay, the federal funding was pulled from X, which that, can you walk us through the dominoes? Because again, I think that's something that a lot of folks are confused about, sort of where was the funding going and where is it not? And then what are those dominoes? And I know obviously not everything is settled, but
Yeah.
there's some thoughts, right, about what might be some of those ramifications.
First big thing to understand is what federal funding is, and what was being funded and what wasn't being funded. In recent years, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was receiving funding directly appropriated by Congress, doesn't go through the executive branch. I mean, the president signs the budget, whatever, but it doesn't go through a federal agency. It goes straight from Congress to this private nonprofit that was set up in 1967 called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And it was created to try to insulate public broadcasters from political interference from either Congress or the White House. Because the people who set this up back in the 1960s realized there could be political interference, political meddling, etc. And they wanted to insulate broadcasters from that. So they created this funding model, and they created a formula that said basically the majority of the funding is going to support public TV. Radio was actually initially left out in the early discussions of the early formulation of the bill that created public broadcasting. Radio was considered an afterthought. And a group of university-based stations really lobbied to get radio included. NPR didn't exist yet at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a push to say, hey, we need radio at the table. So basically, the deal that was worked out was something like, and I hate quoting numbers off the top of my head because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it worked out to be 60% for television, 20% for radio, the remainder for systems support, and a very small slice for the operations of CPB. And when I say system support, that basically is the satellite system that was designed to connect stations.
Okay.
And that was the framework that operated for decades until a few months ago. But what actually got funded? The criticism of public broadcasting was, oh, we want to cut off the funding for NPR. We want to cut off the funding for PBS because we don't like those national organizations. Well, okay, we'll just set that aside, for the sake of argument. We'll just set that aside. The funding wasn't going directly to those national organizations, though. It was primarily going to local stations.
Okay.
Now, local stations can choose what they want to do with those funds. There's a certain portion that is supposed to be spent on programming and programming acquisition, but they don't tell you who you need to buy these programs from. It's the station's decision on what they're going to do with those funds. And that's the way it's worked. So for KVPR, on average over the last few years, the federal funding that we received would, on an annual basis, work out to about $175,000 a year.
Okay.
And that would come in the form of what's called a community service grant. And there was 2 years worth of that forward funding that had already been approved by Congress, including by this Congress and by this president, by President Trump in March of
Mhm.
this year. He signed the continuing resolution that approved a year's worth of funding for CPB and for stations like KVPR. And then in the last part of the Biden administration, in the final 2 years of the Biden administration, there was also another year's worth of funding. So there are 2 years worth of funding sitting at Treasury, waiting to be, that's already been congressionally approved, waiting to be dispersed 1 year at a time, that would typically kick off as of October 1st of this year. And there are a variety of things that happened earlier this year. The executive order that the president issued, big questions about whether that was legal or not. There's actually being heard in court right now. But that didn't really ultimately end the funding. The way that you legally would do it would be to have Congress rescind the funding, and through a process called rescission, Congress did that back in July, and that funding no longer was clawed back, and America no longer has any federal funding for public broadcasting, either radio or television, as of July 18th.
Mhm.
So that's what happened. And now we're trying to figure out what that means for the station and for the system. For KVPR, we may have been defunded, but we are not defeated. We're not going anywhere. Our resolve to serve our listeners has never been stronger. We've been here for 47 years. We're not going anywhere. We're not going away. We're not going silent. Yes, there are stations that will go dark. That is just a reality of what's happening.
Yeah.
At KVPR, about 7% of our budget on average was coming from CPB.
Okay.
We can manage. We'll figure out that we may have to make changes at some level. We're trying to raise as much replacement funding as we can to offset any cuts. We may have to change programs. We may have to have a smaller staff going forward. I hope that's not something that'll happen. I think we're going to be able to avoid the worst of those cuts, because we're seeing a great community response right now.
Amazing.
But there are a lot of stations in rural areas where they're receiving on average 30, 40, 50% of their funding from CPB. And those are the stations that are at risk of going dark. So what's going to happen in Alaska? What's going to happen to these tribal stations in the Southwest? What's going to happen to these rural stations in the Midwest that in their entire listening area, they may have 20 or 30,000 people, but they might be the only broadcast station that's serving those people? It's not going to be something that, a for-profit broadcaster is not going to be able to turn a profit serving that community. But the public station was able to provide that service because of the federal support. That's really what is at risk here.
Mhm.
And the idea that we have a true nationwide service that serves all of America and is available without a paywall, without any other barriers to entry. So we are not going away. NPR is not going away. NPR got very little, only a very small sliver of its overall budget came directly from CPB. Only 30% of its budget comes from stations. So this defunding NPR and PBS through this congressional action, it's going to hurt local stations. It's going to hurt local listeners. It's probably not going to achieve the desired result if the desired result of those backing this defunding is to punish or to get rid of a national NPR show because someone doesn't like what they reported or didn't report.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Really appreciate that thorough explanation, because it is, yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions obviously tied with all of this. And one silver lining, which I hate even to use that phrase in
Yeah.
this particular context, but it has definitely elevated the conversation of how this all does work and where the funding actually does come from, and all of that. So I think that is actually very useful for the public to really understand. So and will motivate, like you're seeing here in the Central Valley, folks to contribute, to the cause should they feel, this is something that they really value. So, yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. Because
yeah.
you don't want to be in a situation where everybody thinks you have plenty of money coming from somewhere, and that's not true. And then they don't give as a result, right? So I think this really good transparency, I think, is very helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the challenges that the system has faced over the years. In other countries, public broadcasters are funded at a very different level than in America. And there's, the BBC has a television tax, or I should say, the BBC in the UK is funded by a television tax that is pretty hefty.
Mhm.
I'm not proposing that that's what America should do, but what I'm saying is I think there's been a perception amongst some that America provides, the federal government provides the type of funding that pays for all of what it takes to run a radio or a public television station. And that's not been the case really ever.
Mhm.
Um, and it's been a difficult process to communicate that, in that, hey, public radio, it's supported by the federal government, but it's only a small slice, so we still need your support. And walking that messaging line and trying to explain to people how it works, like visually you can do it, but radio is not a visual medium, so it's like you can't see the pie chart of the funding, and sometimes that's been a hard thing to convey.
Mhm.
And I agree with you. I don't like using the silver lining word either, but I think that there can be um, opportunities for thinking about things in new ways and approaching things in new ways out of a bad situation. And I think this is one of them. There is a lot more clarity on the funding model now,
Yes.
because it's 100%, this station now is 100% supported by what we raise in our community. It's local listeners, it's sponsorships from businesses, the money we raise in our fundraising events, and then charitable foundations and the support that they provide. That's it. There is no more federal support. We aren't going anywhere. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is shutting down, but we are not shutting down. CPB was a pass-through entity, essentially,
Mhm.
had a pretty small staff, and their job was to take the federal funding, disperse it out to stations, make sure stations are following the rules that Congress set up for that funding and for the way that they operate their stations, legally and things like that. Um, but uh, but yeah, there's been a lot of confusion just in like, what is your station a part of PBS? Because PBS stands for Public Broadcasting System. So does that include radio? There lots of confusion. You wouldn't design the system like this today if we were starting from scratch or naming the way things the way they were named. But that's just a legacy from the way things were set up a long time ago. And this is a great education opportunity, and frankly an opportunity to let people know that public media is alive and very vibrant and serving our communities and grounded in our communities, um, every community in America.
Thank you. So while we're talking about challenges, how do you respond to, criticism that NPR has a political bias and potentially perhaps a trickle-down effect to y'all, but primarily it's something that some folks say about NPR.
I think I would be the last person to suggest that NPR or local stations or even KVPR is in some way, or should be in some way, above criticism. Uh, in the meetings that I've had with different station leaders and NPR leaders, there is healthy debate about a lot of different things, and we there's always different perspectives on issues. Um, Sometimes I'll hear listeners say, I like your station because to me, it's you guys are unbiased. And I appreciate hearing that from listeners. I don't like that word unbiased because I feel like that is a standard that no human can ultimately attain.
Right.
I think we we do aim to be objective. I think that for the most part, and I'm saying as a network and also as a local station, I think for the most part, NPR does a pretty good job of that. Have has the network always lived up to that? No, and you will see many examples that NPR's own ombudsman has called out and saying, I don't think the network approached this story the right way, or something was missing from this story. But NPR is one of the few media organizations that still has an ombudsman or public editor on staff, and I think there's a variety of different approaches, and I think that the network has been has tried to address this. They've made some changes over the last few years to try to make sure that that we're living up to the editorial standards that I think I encourage everyone to read at npr.org, or just Google NPR editorial standards. It's really a great document, and I think is a great tool that every newsroom in the system can try to live up to every day. That said, there were some recent criticisms that came out, some from a former NPR editor. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on that, but I think that a lot of the criticism was that he leveled specifically was, coming from an editor, really should have been edited better. And there were a lot of things that were conveniently omitted that could have provided a better context to the understanding of what was going on, and creative omissions and other instances where there might be a kernel of truth in a criticism, but a lot of other things that were not said. For example, NPR got a lot of criticism, as did other media organizations, for not covering more aggressively the Hunter Biden laptop story. That's true, and NPR's CEO has said, we should have done more on that. But I think a key point in was taking that, for example, NPR was not in possession of the laptop. The New York Post was. NPR did not have the opportunity to independently verify the authenticity of that hard drive and the information in it. And NPR, didn't at the time go, and just repeat the Post's story. And you say, and a critic may say, well, it really should have, and that's an example of why NPR is biased and why NPR should go away. All right, you're entitled to your opinion. But let's go back, 4 years, and go back to the Steele dossier. The same exact type of scenario. Steele dossier comes out with all these allegations about then candidate Donald Trump, and it had its roots in opposition research operation. Hired a British intelligence or ex-British intelligence officer to dig up dirt on then candidate Trump. I think it was BuzzFeed, and then McClatchy wound up running with these allegations, which have never been independently verified to this date. NPR took the exact same approach with the Steele dossier. It did not run with that story because it could not independently verify the authenticity of this information. So I think having a broader understanding sometimes of an editorial philosophy or approach can be helpful. That said, the other thing that I think is a challenge and is really difficult today is that America is increasingly increasingly polarized. I'm trying to find some more profound way of saying that, but like we are in a world where the different ends of the political spectrum are, it seems in most cases, maybe with a few exceptions, uh, going in an expanding universe of viewpoints, not just about politics, but about basic facts. And NPR has long prided itself as being one of the only news organizations that aims to speak to all Americans.
Mhm.
And that means two things. It means, A, that we have a station in every community, or pretty much a station serving 99% of the American population geographically through broadcast signal coverage. But then B, the intent of NPR has been at its, and you can debate whether it's executed this well, and I would say it's probably fallen short more often than it would like to, in that NPR has tried to reflect the plurality and the diversity of voices from all these different walks of life and ethnic backgrounds, occupations, regional differences. And so that the idea being that you turn on the radio and what you're going to hear, not at any one point, but over a span of time, is something that is representative of the fabric of America. And the problem with that today is we are in a time where people on both sides, the criticism is most often on one side, but I would say on both sides, there is a sentiment that I don't want to hear from those people on your radio station. That's the criticism that listeners, critics, maybe ones that don't listen all that much, or maybe just occasionally tune in. That's what I hear the most. And again, it comes from both the left and the right. People on the right, we don't get a lot of criticism to say, I really don't like NPR's coverage of the president's handling of the Federal Reserve or the jobs numbers or whatever. The criticisms we hear, usually from conservative voices, are I don't like NPR's coverage of LGBTQ issues. I don't like NPR's coverage of issues involving abortion or birth control or things like that, because I don't like hearing about those people. I find that lifestyle offensive. That's what these people are telling me. And my response is, we do our best to try to cover the news of all of America. And that's going to reflect people who have different views than you and different lifestyles than you. At the same time, I remember back in, what was it, February, March, or April? Sometime I guess around the first 100 days, NPR had Steve Bannon on. Get emails. Why does NPR have that right-wing whatever on the air? I can't believe you guys. Or why would you give airtime to what the president is saying? He shouldn't be on the air. You shouldn't cover that. Exact same thing. And you can say whether one's right or wrong, and that's going to be on your own political viewpoint. But the idea historically that public radio stations were trying to give voice to the spectrum of ideas and reflect the diversity of the country. That's a really challenging thing to do these days. And um, and assume that everyone's going to like that.
Yeah.
And clearly there are limits. You're not going to put, um, you're not going to, give Adolf Hitler an hour-long show um, on the radio. There are limits to that, but the idea that because NPR has stories about the trans community that and people are entitled to their opinion that, okay, I don't want to listen to your station because I don't want to hear those stories about those people. And I get calls like that. Um, they're entitled to their opinion, but at the same time, from being a news organization, we're trying to reflect the diversity of our community and the diversity of the world that we live in. That is part of our job. And I think that that's, in America today, increasingly challenging to do that and also make sure that everyone is happy with the way that federal funds are spent.
Right.
So, I don't know what that means for the future of public broadcasting, and if there is any federal role in supporting public media in the future. If CPB comes back, I'm not sure CPB is going to come back in anything like its current form. I would venture to guess that if there is future public support for public broadcasting, it's going to come in a very different form, and it's probably not going to be in the way we've known it. But I think that given the polarization in America today, it has become increasingly an impossibility to run a news organization that is rooted in bringing a multiplicity of voices to the air, being rooted in facts, and maintaining political support through the whims of change that are the norm in Washington right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. So, last two questions about the future.
Yeah.
So, your crystal ball, what do you see for the future of public broadcasting? And what would you tell a young journalist who was interested in public media?
Wow. Okay. Future of public broadcasting. I think that the biggest stations are going to be okay. I think KVPR is going to be okay as well. We're working on raising money to replace the funding that was lost. It's about $175,000. We've come close to about 2/3 of that, about raising 2/3 of that since rescission passed. I think we're up. I think we'll get there. My concern isn't this fiscal year that's coming to a close, it's next year. And where are we at 12 months from now when this has died off of the news cycle and people aren't thinking about it as much. So we're working very hard to get new monthly members, monthly supporters of the station. This is a great opportunity for people who have been listening for a long time and who've never given to become supporters, because it really does matter. And I think it plays both ways. I heard a broadcast with the general manager of the Boise NPR station, and he said he heard from two different types of listeners who were angry about federal funding. He said, I hear from one type of listener, they call me up and say, I don't like the idea of federal funding for public media, and they hang up. Mm. The other person calls up and said, I don't like the idea of funding for public media. Here's a check. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing some of that. It's probably not going to be enough for the smallest stations, those rural stations. So I think you're going to see gaps in coverage. There's some unknowns. I'm not sure about how we'll navigate the future of music because there's some intellectual property rights that CPB had negotiated deals with music licensing firms and had also paid those deals on the behalf of stations. And we aren't sure how that's going to play out. It's all going to be sorted out in the next few months. Will that impact our ability to continue to have the 24-hour a day classical music service we currently have? I hope not, but we'll see. On a broader picture, I think that there's going to be a further evolution of public media and what it means in a digital environment. NPR is one of the leading producers of podcast content. Stations as well do an incredible job of creating amazing podcasts. KVPR is pretty small, and our podcast operation is pretty small. But last year, almost a year ago, we launched our new daily news podcast called Central Valley Daily. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And it comes out 5 days a week, every morning, with news headlines and then one in-depth conversation or feature story about something that's happening in the Valley. I think you're going to see more digital innovation. I think you're going to see maybe more localism on the air. It may ultimately not be as polished as the national productions, but for 30 years there was a pendulum that swung this way that said national distribution is where it's at. Integrate your local content within the national shows because that's what audience is responding to. That's where you can maximize your service and it's uniform quality, high production value programming. I think the pendulum might be starting to swing back in the other direction towards more localism and more local service and being more rooted in your community, because that's like radio's true superpower. We can go out to the farmer's market or on Art Hop and like have our hosts there. And like, we are in your community. AI cannot go and be there. You can't talk to they're not real people that live in your community and are going to your youth soccer games and your PTA meetings and whatever. So we want to lean into the radio as localism angle and the community engagement angle and see where that takes us. Local can be very expensive to do at a high level, but we'll see. I think there's going to be innovation there, and the way that technology will play in that is going to be interesting. I think that's what you're going to see. What I would encourage for students who are involved, radio is incredibly dynamic and has been for its entire history. Radio, if you look at the history of radio, radio has reinvented itself every 25 years or so. And I don't think that's going to stop just because political whims in Washington or podcasting is 20 something years old. So what's going to be the next wave and what's going to be the next way that we use this technology? Radio has been written off multiple times in its history, and it's always come back. And you've got stations posting their strongest audience numbers in years, in some cases ever, just this last year. So audience is still there. Audience is older than it was. And I think our big job right now is, talking to Gen Z and letting Gen Z know we are there and having a conversation with Gen Z on their native platforms. But, ultimately, I think people sometimes at least come to public radio, at least, when they're a little bit older. And that's when so we want to have brand awareness. And I think we're doing that as a system with like the NPR Tiny Desk concerts that have huge followings on TikTok and things like that. So we want to let the youngest audience know that we exist, and so they hear about the brand. And then we want to really serve the Gen Z and older audiences with content that's rooted in our communities. So, what does that mean for the student who's getting involved right now? Key opportunity. There are going to be a lot of people. There's going to be a lot of turnover in the industry in the next few years. If you are skilled in a variety of different platforms and tools and skill sets, you've got a great opportunity, and not just the technology of those, but the storytelling ability in those. Doing just one thing, we've had convergence, we've been talking about convergence for 30 years, but now it's the other side of the coin. It's all right, you can be great at TikTok, but how can you also be great at these other platforms? And then how can we create once, publish everywhere, and do that from a digital first perspective? Right. So then adapt that content for radio or another platform or other socials or other media. So I would say future is still very bright. The federal funding was just a slice. It's going to be a slice of the pie. It's going to be a big adjustment, but with that adjustment and the other technological and societal changes that are underway, it's going to be a very dynamic time. And I think this is going to be a time when forward-thinking stations need to lean into that change and accelerate that, and not pull back, and not just you take this as an opportunity to retrench on the old models, but really try to do something new. So I think the future is bright. We've got two Fresno State one Fresno State intern and one student journalist here on a part-time basis, and they're doing great work, and we're excited about what the future holds, and the talent that's coming out of the university is really stellar right now.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Oh my goodness. This has been so interesting and helpful. And thank you so much for, offering clarity and also a little, window into your crystal ball, because this is a very dynamic time for public radio. So we're so grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Yay. And thank you also to all of our listeners and viewers. We appreciate you joining us today. You are invited to tune in to next season, and we will certainly announce when that is, because we definitely are going to continue to explore journalism's future. Obviously, this is a topic that continues to have lots and lots to explore and to discover. So this is Exploring Journalism's Future, a podcast powered by the Institute for Media and Public Trust at Fresno State. So until then, please keep the faith, and for the love of democracy, please join us in this crucial conversation. Thank you.